And that mindset that got you to where you are could actually be what's keeping you from getting to the next level.
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to Truth Works, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change. I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Truth Works. Today, we are talking to this fascinating woman named Dr. Margie Warrell. Dr. Margie is a 6-time best-selling author, Fortune 500 leadership advisor, TEDx and keynote speaker. So, Dr. Margie, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you. Tell us a little bit about you and how this all came about.
Oh, we have to go back a long way, I think, Jessica.
Yeah, that's fine. Take us back. Let's go.
We go back to a rural farming community in Southeast Australia where I was born and grew up. My dad milked cows for 50 years. My mother had been a nun for 9 years.
Oh, a nun.
Prior to leaving the convent, meeting my dad, and I am the big sister of 7. My horizons for my life extended a little beyond the back paddock, Jess. So let's just say that the path I forged was certainly not the default path.
Sure.
I guess it does align. It brings me to where I am because ever since I left home at 18 and, was the first generation kid going to college in Melbourne, Australia, I have just continually embraced almost a spirit of adventure and, what's possible in my life, in everything I've done is obviously beyond what might have thought, even conceived of, couldn't have even imagined as a kid, as a teenager. But also over the years, I have also become to just have a deep passion, I would actually say a calling, like a vocation to helping other people live the biggest version for their lives, whatever that is that inspires them. And I've ended up doing a lot of work in the workplace, working with a lot of different organizations around the world. I've lived around the world from Papua New Guinea to Singapore. And of course, I live here in the US now. This is my second time. I've sort of put down roots and it's home. And helping people get out of their own way and deal with those invisible forces embedded deep in our psychological DNA that keep us from doing the very things that would enable us to thrive more and to build more connection, to create more rewarding lives, and also to be someone that ultimately helps others, do better and to scale that in our teams and our cultures so that everyone gets to grow into their fullest potential. So I feel like that's been a really high level and there's a lot of stories in between.
I'm sure. Well, so you've written many books and I think you have a new book out talking about courage and the title of it is The Courage Gap, right? But you sort of kind of got on this path of speaking about courage, bravery, things that are possible and why our brains sort of hold us back. Was there something that happened to you personally that pushed you on this path to have this aha?
There are several factors and I'm mindful of how much time we have, but I grew up, when I was 13, I developed an eating disorder. I had bulimia. I was vulnerable to all the messaging you get, skinny is good, and I wasn't skinny, eating a lot of full cream milk and, fried food and what have you. But anyway, I developed this eating disorder that didn't ruin anything for me in terms of I was a high achieving kid who always worked really hard and no one would have known. But that was sort of at play through my teens, university, and it flared up again when I moved to Papua New Guinea as a 26-year-old. So that's one thing. Also, when I was in Papua New Guinea as a 26-year-old, I'd met my husband, we got married, and I said, I don't want to stay living in Melbourne. I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool to live in New York or London? And we both had a competition. Who can get the first overseas transfer with their job? And he said, I think I've got one. He goes, it's not where you probably want to go. And I'm thinking, okay, I could do Shanghai or Hong Kong. And he goes, Port Moresby. And so we ended up living there. But while there, I found myself, one, obviously, eating disorder flared up. There was, I think, just the stress of being in an environment. It was the most dangerous country outside a war zone at the time. Secondly, I found myself being the confidant of a lot of amazing women who were also there, in their 20s or early 30s and smart lawyers, doctors, but caught up in some pretty self-sabotaging behaviors. And I found myself constantly trying to counsel them as a friend, but with a very limited toolbox. And then during that time, I also ended up being pregnant, and I was 5 months pregnant when I ended up in an armed robbery and had a gun at my head up on the ground, sort of in the threat of rape. And there's a lot of gang rape that happens there, which was pretty traumatic. And then 10 days later was told that the baby I thought I was carrying had died.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Horrible.
Yeah. It really obviously rocked my world.
Yeah.
I was, 28, 29. But all of those things were all kind of happening in sort of parallel in terms of my own development. I was addressing this eating disorder. I was actually doing a 12-step program. And I was really interested in why smart people do dumb things and why someone that was high functioning like me was trapped in this debilitating shame. I felt a lot of shame around it. I didn't tell people about it. No one would have known. And so in the aftermath of that robbery, I wasn't hurt, by the way, but
thank God.
I went back to school and did psychology, thinking, well, how do I what's a good thing I can find out? And now my next 12 months not looking like what I thought it would look like. I ended up having more miscarriages too. And I went back and studied psychology and thinking, I think I want to be a psychologist. I totally want to change path. I was in actually corporate marketing. And that path led me down toward coaching. I ended up moving back to Australia, moved city there twice, had three children in 3 years, moved to America just after 9/11.
Oh my goodness.
So it was just a lot went on. In 5 years, I moved country, 2 times, house like 4 times, had 3 children, landed in Dallas, Texas, had a 4th child, and I decided, I really want to start a coaching business. Didn't know anyone, literally for 10,000 miles, had 0 professional network and 4 little kids. But I just had a deep fire in my belly. I just had this really deep, I say calling, but I feel like it was sort of just put there. And my faith system is such that I do believe we're all here for a purpose. And that was just what I got, such a deep sense of purpose. And I met so many people who are stuck in their own heads and in their own fears, fear of looking bad, fear of not having what it takes, fear of being exposed as inadequate or a fraud. And so that started the journey as a coach, living in Coppell, Texas in 2003.
I mean, I just find that incredibly inspiring, but also fascinating because a lot of people who might have gone through some of these things would have retreated or, not looked at it as what can I take, what can I learn, what can I do? It almost sort of fueled you or gave you this fire in your belly to do the things that you thought were maybe impossible, but you just decided to do them. So thank you for sharing. What have you found in your research, in your coaching, in just your experience with individuals and companies of, we have this brain inside our head. It's telling us things all the time, mostly lies, right? And so what have you found is the breakthrough from that? Or why do our brains do this to us? Like, why do they tell us we can't when we absolutely can?
Well, our brains were wired for self-preservation, not self-actualization. And our brains have changed very little in 60,000 years, unlike the technology that we rely on to run our lives today. So within each of us is this internal tug of war. And on one side is a desire for us to connect at a really authentic level with other people and to grow and to develop ourselves and to live a life that really matters and lifts other people. And on the other side is this desire to stay secure and safe and look good and avoid feeling vulnerable. Our desire for a deeply rewarding life is in constant competition with our desire to live a secure life. And so cultivating self-awareness is crucial to that, but also just being really clear about the values with which we want to define our lives. And to me, having a belief system that we're all here for a purpose, we can do our very best to control our lives, but there's a lot outside our control. But that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is a gift. And we have to look for that gift. We have to sometimes, it's like a seed. We have to water it. We have to be patient, but that there's something that we can find. There's goodness even in the midst of the most unwanted and awful circumstances. And I think I've always been very committed to finding that gift and to harnessing, harvesting that seed. And I was also raised with an ethos, I guess. My parents were very committed Catholics around, to he who much is given, much is expected, or to she. And while we had very, very little money, I've just always felt this sense of like, my life lived just for me is not going to be deeply rewarding, but if I can use my gifts to help others. And so those things have always been operating in the background. And on top of all of that, I think is just, I guess I had an upbringing where you had to develop a certain sense of grit and resilience, and there was very little in material possessions, and I got to be comfortable being uncomfortable ever since I've sort of learnt to ride horses as a young girl. And so, a willingness to be uncomfortable in pursuit of doing things that sort of give me energy has always served me.
Yeah. A lot of what you just said resonates with me. And I think about the world very similarly to you. And, I have a faith as well. But I think, I don't know, I've always just been more of an optimist. I like to see the good even in the bad. And I do think that has allowed me to work through some of my hardest times in my career and in my personal life. I'm glad that you're saying all that. I think you like came up with like a 5-step kind of program to being braver, right?
Yep.
Like, can we talk about that a little bit? Like, is it, because I think, it's one thing for you and I to sit here and say like, hey, there's a gift in even the hardest times, but practical, actual things one can do to help with see those things or forge through those things, is even better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why I wrote this book, Jessica, because having and look, I've obviously got decades of experience, but also the last 5 years. And I wrote about that in the start of the book. I'd had experiences in the last 5 years while I had felt like, oh yeah, I've been brave and I've put myself out there and I've dealt with a lot of difficulty. And then 2020 came and all of us were jolted outside our comfort zones in 2020. All of us had to deal with circumstances that we felt totally unprepared for, and fear ran wild. And so there was a lot of learning for me. And then I was actually living in Singapore at the time, just for context on this book. And I had 3 children in the United States studying, all of whom found themselves homeless to the extent that Singapore closed its borders. They couldn't go home.
Right.
They had no home to go to.
Yeah.
Their dormitories closed. All kids who were international, any families are international. It was just really difficult on other levels. And because of our circumstance and Singapore closing borders, etc., I had 3 kids that suddenly were trying to find themselves a home. My husband got COVID. He was one of the first people in Singapore to get it. He was locked up for 30 days. I was locked in a quarantine. kids calling from America going, I don't know where to go. And there was just a lot of events there that helped me recognize that courage isn't only about feel your fear and do it anyway. That's a part of it. Absolutely. It's a big part of it. And it's part of it that we often focus on. And I talk about a lot, put yourself out there, go for it. But it's also the management of our fear. And more, I have observed people with a very magnified perception of risk and danger that is disproportionate to the actual danger.
Can you give us an example?
I meet people who are afraid to go to Australia. They're like, oh my gosh, I'd really like to go to Australia, but I'm so scared of all those critters you've got down there. I'm scared I'm going to get bitten by a spider or, killed by a shark or, one of your kangaroos and the list goes on. And
well, it's interesting to me too, because I think with this fear, like there's so much information being forwarded to people, also misinformation, right? That I think plays into people's fear and anxiety because we're inundated with that on our phones and in social media and the news and all of the constant information that we're getting. And I don't know what you think, but I think that might, in terms of fear management, that's a big factor.
Absolutely. I think it's a huge factor that we are living in this time where we are glued to our devices with news feeds whose algorithms are engineered to stoke anxiety and insecurity. And more, we are bombarded with these reasons for why we should be afraid that 20 years ago, you had to buy the paper, you watched the nightly news, there was this new, CNN, whatever, but now it's everywhere, all the time, all at once, hitting up on us with reasons why we should be afraid that it's the end of the world as we know it. And add in, obviously, political polarization. It's just very, very overwhelming for many people's nervous system, a nervous system that was designed to keep us safe from predators on the plains, not, for the world that we're living in today. And so I think that's why we see more people struggling with anxiety and needing anxiety medications than ever before in history, even though statistically it is the safest time in human history to be alive. So there's this disconnect. There's an emotions phobia. People are just afraid of so many things. And I've witnessed it for a long time, but I've seen it ramp up exponentially. And so I think all of these things are working to keep us feeling so anxious all the time. And it's why I wanted to write this book, because the concept of the courage gap is that so often we know what to do, we have access to information, we are educated, we have the knowledge, and yet we don't do what we know. And fear widens the gap between our ability to take actions, and it takes courage to close that gap. And yet, before we can step into that gap and do those things we're afraid of, we also have to look at, where am I more afraid than I need to be? And maybe what do I really need to be afraid of? Where am I so focused on the short-term risks that I'm missing out and not thinking about what is it that I put at risk if I don't do this thing, if I don't make this change in my career and leave my awesome job at Netflix, if I don't have that difficult conversation with someone, if I, lower my mask and share with people what's really going on for me, I'm terrified that they won't like me anymore and I'll be socially outcast. We often just miscalculate and don't give enough thought to what are the longer term vulnerabilities that we create for ourselves when we constantly are acting in a very self-protective, defensive mode.
Mm-hmm. So in the steps, when you're in this mode, what's the first thing you should do?
I start the book by encouraging people to focus on what it is that they want and not what they fear. Our brains will always go to the deficits, to what could go wrong, to what we don't have, to what shouldn't be happening, to all of the things we don't want or can't do. And so it's so important to put our focus on what it is we can do and what we do want, because what we focus on expands and it takes up our mental real estate. And if we're always focused on the problems, then we're actually shutting down our innate creative capacity to come up with more novel solutions. And so, intention matters, attention matters, focus matters. And so that first step in the book is really about really resetting your intention for what it is you most want, for the highest good for yourself, for the situation you're in right now, and putting your focus onto those things. And that's a very deliberate act, because so often we get caught up, and I do too, and I have to practice this myself. Instead of going, oh, it shouldn't be this way, going, you know what, Margie? What's your intention right now? Yeah, there's a lot of things that aren't as you'd like it to be, but what is it you can do? I mean, I've got, as I shared before, we pressed record, I have 4 kids in their 20s and, trying to launch them all onto paths that will leverage their unique strengths and gifts and help them be independent, paying their own way adults is a really big thing. So instead of going, oh, I wish they weren't spending their time over here, I'm like, how can I just support them in doing more of what I know is going to help them set them up over the long haul? But the same is true for all of us, Jessica. And, I look at it in the workplace. I talk to so many people that are focused on, oh, my company this and can't do that, and my boss this and my colleagues that, versus, well, what can you do? What is it you'd really love, and who could help you get there? And just helping them, expand their aperture on what are the things that you could be doing right now that you're not doing.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I want to transition a little bit into how things play out in organizations and at work. So tell me about how fear plays out in the workplace. What do you think the impact it has on organizations and maybe even the bottom line? I don't know.
Yeah, a big impact on the bottom line. And that's not just me saying it. There is, just this morning, Harvard Business School did a research, culture, organizations that are courage-driven cultures, where there's obviously high psychological safety. And my conversations with Amy Edmondson, who sort of coined that term, as she says, courage and psychological safety go hand in hand, two sides of the same coin, because it's safe for you to speak up and do the brave thing. So you're going to have the conversations. You're going to share what you didn't understand or what you got wrong. You're going to try something even though you're not sure you're going to get the best outcome because you're not terrified of what will happen. Those cultures, teams with high psych safety outperform teams with low. It's number one predictor of success and business outcomes. I mean, in a world that's changing fast, the faster your organization can learn, that in itself is a business strategy. So to me, fear is always going to shut down the very conversations, the collaborations, the innovation, the experimentation, the learning, and sharing the learning that comes from failure. That just totally creates this slow leak of value and loss of edge that totally shows up, on the balance sheet over time. It can be delayed. I call it the timidity tax. It's delayed. It's not obvious in the moment, but it totally shows up over time. And so if you think about it, organizations are just individual behavior at scale. But because when you've got a lot of individuals working together, when loyal dissent is normalized, when candor is expected, respectful, kind candor is expected and it's rewarded, when smart experimentation is not a really risky thing to do, there's going to be so much value unleashed from that and collaboration that you get all those synergies. When fear prevails, when it's governing decisions, when it's governing how teams team together, and I might disagree with you, but you end up with the low common denominator decisions that are the dumbest decisions. Like everyone goes, okay, well, I signed off. I didn't think it was a very good idea. And everyone kind of thinks the same thing because people weren't willing to go, I don't think that's a good idea. And you don't have that robust debate. So there's just on so many metrics, one, how people, one individually, two, how they team together, three, the implication of that on innovation and, product, iteration over time. All of that has a huge impact, customer service across the board. And I think there's so many examples of that. And you also look at the examples of whether it's the Volkswagen scandal, whether it's BP, Deepwater Horizon, going all the way back to NASA, the Boeing 737 disaster, all of those, every single one of those, Blockbuster, Kodak, can be traced back to decisions that were governed by fear and not by courage and values-aligned action. People were afraid to speak up. If they did raise a concern and it was shut down, they didn't get pushed back because they didn't feel that would yield fruit. Those in leadership roles were afraid of what would happen if they cannibalized their existing market share of, you think of, Sony, what do we used to have? Walkmans. They want to cannibalize the existing share, even though they had digital technology before Apple did. And so again and again, you see decisions that were governed by fear. So there is a profound tax on the commercial viability and the competitive edge of organizations where fear is dominating decisions.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned Blockbuster because Netflix, we were a big part of the historical, I wouldn't say demisal, but we beat them because we did have a culture that was grounded in candor and feedback and taking risk, and all of those things were rewarded, and we had those from the get-go. And I think one of the reasons why we were able to be so competitive against this big, large company and ultimately win was because we had an operating culture that was far more excellent than theirs, right? The companies that don't make that second S curve, right, in business generally don't, because they're fearful of jeopardizing the revenue that's coming in from the thing that made them successful in the first place.
And they're fearful because they're so short-term focused. And the reality is, if you're CEO of a publicly listed company, there is enormous pressure on quarterly results.
Yep.
And so you're like, heck, do we jeopardize our video DVD rental business because we're trying to move over to this digital streaming thing when we're getting 90% of our revenue over here? You're like, they're all looking at us for the revenue. And so there is this big pressure on that short-term dividend that's going to be paid out, that short-term result. And that's where I think it takes a lot of courage for a leader. And that's where I've really value my opportunity to support those in exec roles to go, hey, everyone, including our stakeholders and investors, we need to look further toward the horizon here. This is what the future is that's coming at us. And we are not setting ourselves up to yield it, to seize the opportunities there. In the meanwhile, Netflix over here obviously blundered a little bit, as you know, but it didn't, but then said, we've got to get on board because that's where the puck is going, to quote Wayne Gretzky. We're going to be where the puck's going. And that's going to take us making some changes and admitting what we got wrong. And I think, that sort of leadership that was at Netflix, a willingness to go, hey, we got some stuff wrong here, and just fall on that sword and go, but this is what we're going to do now to make it right. And I see a lot of behaviors from senior leaders who are unwilling to say, hey, our strategy is not yielding fruit and we've got to change it, because there's a lot of ego at play and people don't like to admit that they haven't got things right, and they want to think that then, they don't want to damage their Midas touch reputation. There's a lot of insecure overachievers sitting in very senior executive roles. They've got there because of what they do. They're smart, they're results driven, they have extraordinary work ethic and stamina. They get there and they get moving up and up and up. But, they get up there because of what they do, but then they cap themselves because of who they are, because they haven't shone the light inside themselves at those things where they feel the most vulnerable. And so their decisions are guided from avoiding what makes them vulnerable versus what will enable them to make their highest point of impact, to add as much value in the longer term. And so that short-term self-protective behavior, impression management, let me make sure my stock is rising, literally and reputationally, and it's not falling.
Right. I wanted to kind of end on that note and talk just a little bit about leadership all the time. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I talk about how we fail leaders all the time because they get these roles because of what they've done, not because they've proven to be a good leader, right? And nobody ever teaches them how to be, right? So what would be your advice to leaders in general to tap into that vulnerability or to break through some of these challenges?
Yeah, I can only encourage people who have risen to heights, which is obviously a feather in our cap, but also an immense responsibility as well as a privilege, is to do the inner work that really amplifies outer effectiveness over time. Because all of that hard work and hustle that got you here and that mindset that got you to where you are could actually be what's keeping you from getting to the next level, to really being the extraordinary CEO versus the one that just kept getting, winning rungs all the way up. So I would just say take some time out to reflect on the kind of leader that you most want to be. And I wrote about this in the Courage Gap too, about the importance of putting your to-be list ahead of your to-do list and getting clarity about who do you want to be? What are the values that define how you really want to show up? Are you someone that people would really want to follow? And not because of what you can do for them, because you're powerful and that they're afraid that if they don't, they're in trouble, but because of who you are. And that can sometimes take looking in the mirror and going, you know what, there's aspects of who I am that I know aren't aligned with my really deepest values, and doing that inner work. And I always think that, the first person you need to develop as a leader is ultimately yourself. But there's a lot of people who get to high places who've never taken much time because they've been so busy just delivering the results to reflect on who they want to be as a human being and how they want to measure their lives beyond the title that they got to or the income that they made or, the size of the business that they built.
Yeah, I have experienced the same thing and I love that. So if you're listening, leaders, take a moment and have some self-reflection. It will do you good. I hope you'll do a career confession with me.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, here's the title of the question. Am I being too harsh on the new hire? 3 months ago, we made an addition to the senior leadership team, bringing someone new to the organization in a never-done-before role. We were initially really excited to have them and their expertise on board, but I'm not sure if they're 100% suited to the role and the company, as they seem to be struggling, mainly at communicating, decisions, etc. I don't want them to feel micromanaged or babied, but we really need them to step up quickly or we will have to let them go. Interesting, Dr. Margie. What do you say?
I think this speaks to the importance of hiring slow. And being,
sure.
Because what I'm hearing here is, so I worked as a senior partner in board CEO succession at Korn Ferry for 3.5 years. And during that time worked a lot with boards, but also in the decision, who's going to go into, say, the executive team, and you're doing an assessment of people and what are their experiences, what are their competencies and skills, what are the mindsets they bring, etc. And there's always going to be gaps. There's no perfect candidate usually, but you want to make sure those gaps are manageable gaps and what they don't know and what they haven't done, what's new for them. And what I'm hearing here from that question is someone who was put into a role and perhaps the gaps were actually pretty significant, that they may have needed more development before they were put into that role. But I think that's always something when you're making decisions of who's going to go into roles, Are these gaps ones, they're all risk factors. How big a risk factor is it? Because this person hasn't done this, that, and the other. And what I'm hearing here is like, we don't think they're going to be able to close some of those gaps quickly enough. They might get there in 2 years, but we need them there in 6 months.
Right.
And so I often think it's unfair on putting someone in that role because maybe they've got the potential, but they haven't had the development at this point. They haven't had enough of the different experiences. They've never worked over in this area. They haven't got that. So I would actually say this could reflect as an indictment on the decision process that put them there. I would also say here that there may be a difficult decision made that they might need to go. I mean, obviously you want to coach them to competency, but will they get there quickly enough? And at some point, a judgment decision has to be made. Yeah. I don't think it ever does someone a favor to leave them in a role in which they are floundering because they know they're not cutting it too. That's not helping them. I'm not blaming the person. If someone offered me a big role, would I take it? I'd go, yeah, but here's the things that I would need significant support with to do it, say. But I think that sometimes the courageous decision might be to go, you know what, we're going to have to move you out because it's actually creating risk factors for the business because you're not able to accelerate quickly enough in this role to keep up and execute on the strategy that we've got in place, and all the other cogs in the machine are moving at speed and you're not able to. So obviously, without any more context, I would say there could be a decision there that but you also need to go, who else have we got? Yeah. And maybe there's a decision where we need to bring in someone who's an excellent operator right underneath them to fill in a lot of their gaps.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. The one thing I thought about when reading the question is they mentioned it's a never done before role in the company. So, whenever that's the case, you don't know a lot about what you need until someone kind of gets in there and starts doing it. I think it could be that you're learning, and now that you're learning and they're in the role, you need something else. But if I channel my Dr. Margie courage, I think you just go have a conversation with this person about it and to say, hey, you're new in this role. This is a new role to the organization. We're not quite sure you're on track or we're on track. Let's have a conversation about what success is going to look like. And it could just be that context is lacking. But I think people avoid those hard conversations because of fear.
100%. Right? There can be a lot at stake when people don't have those conversations. I think your point on what are the expectations, how do we make this work? But if given it is a new role, I think whenever you've got a new role, you have to embrace somewhat, I call it an experimental mindset, going, let's see how this goes. Let's review regularly. Let's shorten the learning cycle and the feedback cycle. What's working? What's not working? Maybe we need to bring on someone else to take on this part of the role. So I think that anytime you've got a new role and you're putting someone into it, you have to expect there's going to be iteration and some growing pains organizationally, but also, as you figure out what this role will look like and how that will interface with all of the other roles on the executive or on whatever team it's on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Margie, thank you so much. And listen, if our listeners want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
They can find me on my website, margiewarrell.com. I'm doing more and more speaking, keynote speaking and facilitating, exec offsites and retreats. And so please feel free to reach out to me and see how I can support what you're doing, because culture matters, leadership matters more than ever. And so that's why I do what I do.
Thanks for listening to Truth Works. This episode was produced by Megan Hayward. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.